The engine died without warning. No cough, no sputter, no final gasp of protest, just silence, sudden and absolute. On a stretch of road that Amelia Grant had driven 100 times before, the steering wheel locked slightly in her hands. The dashboard lights blinked once, twice, then faded into nothing. And in that moment, as the car rolled slowly to the shoulder and stopped, Amelia did not think about her board meeting. She did not think about the quarterly earnings report sitting on her desk, or the 3 unanswered calls from her chief financial officer, or the press conference scheduled for Thursday morning, where she was supposed to announce the largest acquisition in her company's 12-year history. She thought about her father. She thought about a Saturday afternoon when she was 9 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of this exact car, watching his hands on the wheel, listening to him explain, in that patient, unhurried way of his, how a real engine talks to you if you know how to listen. The most expensive garage in the city looked the car over for less than an hour before the manager walked out, wiped his hands on a clean cloth, and said, without particular regret, "I'm sorry. It's beyond repair." The people standing nearby offered looks of polite sympathy. A few of them smiled. And somewhere in the back of that garage, from a corner nobody had been paying attention to, a man covered in grease set down his wrench and said something that made the whole room laugh. A few days later, nobody was laughing anymore. Amelia Grant had built her name on things that other people said were impossible. At 38, she was the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Technologies, a company that had grown from a 2-person startup operating out of a rented office space in Austin, Texas, into a global firm with offices on 4 continents and a valuation that financial analysts argued about in hushed, slightly disbelieving tones. She had been on the cover of 3 major business publications. She had delivered keynotes at conferences where every seat was filled. She had negotiated deals that other executives called unreasonable, and she had won most of them. To the outside world, Amelia Grant was the kind of woman who did not lose. She was composed, precise, relentlessly prepared. She wore her confidence like a second skin. And when she walked into a room, people noticed not because she demanded attention, but because she had learned, over years of being underestimated, how to carry herself in a way that made dismissal difficult. But the outside world does not see everything. It does not see a woman eating dinner alone in a penthouse apartment that is beautifully decorated and completely quiet. It does not see the way she sometimes stands at her office window on Friday evenings, looking at the city below, feeling somehow distant from all of it, as if the success she had worked so hard to build had lifted her slightly above the life she had imagined for herself, and she had not entirely decided whether that was a good thing. Her father, Robert Grant, had died 6 years earlier. He had been a mechanical engineer by training, a tinkerer by nature, and the kind of man who believed that understanding how something worked was a form of respect, that you could not truly appreciate a thing without knowing what held it together. He had passed those beliefs on to Amelia in the way that parents pass things on without realizing it, through repetition, through example, through 1,000 small moments that only become meaningful in retrospect. The car he had left her was a 1964 Ford Galaxie, dark blue, with chrome trim and a bench seat that had been reupholstered at some point in a deep burgundy that her father had chosen himself. It was not a rare car in the collector's sense, not a vehicle that would have drawn crowds at an auction or commanded a premium price at a specialty dealership. Its value was entirely personal, entirely tied to memory, entirely irreplaceable. Amelia had maintained it carefully. She hired a specialist twice a year to inspect it. She kept it garaged, covered, protected from the elements. She did not drive it often, only on days that felt significant. Her father's birthday, the anniversary of his death, and occasionally on the morning of a decision that frightened her, because driving it had a way of steadying her, of connecting her to something solid and real. Underneath all the velocity of her professional life, that Tuesday morning, she had been driving it to a private ceremony, a small, quiet event at which her father's name would be added to the wall of a community engineering program he had helped to fund 20 years earlier. It was not a public event. It was not a business obligation. It was simply the one thing she had planned for that week that had nothing to do with Meridian Technologies, and she had looked forward to it with a warmth that she rarely allowed herself at the office. The engine died 8 minutes from her destination. She sat for a long moment in the sudden silence, her hand still on the wheel. And then she pulled out her phone and called the most reputable garage in the city. Sterling Automotive had been in business for 31 years. It occupied a wide, well-lit space on the east side of the city, and its reputation had been built on a combination of technical competence and aggressive confidence. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Webb, had started the place when he was 26 years old, and he had spent 3 decades cultivating the kind of authority that came with being the person everyone called when something expensive broke. His staff were good at what they did. They were also, as a consequence of working in an environment where competence was the baseline expectation, not particularly patient with problems that resisted easy solution. When the Galaxie was towed in that afternoon, it was assigned immediately to 2 of the senior technicians, who worked on it for the better part of 3 hours. Amelia waited in the reception area. She answered emails. She took 2 calls. She drank a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long and told herself that it would be fine, that the car could be fixed, that there was always something that could be done. Marcus Webb came out at 4:15 in the afternoon. He was not unkind, but he was direct in the way that people are direct when they have delivered the same kind of news before and have learned not to soften it past a certain point. The carburetor had failed, he explained. But that was not the primary problem. The primary problem was the engine block itself, which had developed a hairline fracture that had been spreading, probably for years, compromising the structural integrity of the entire unit. Several components critical to the engine's function had been discontinued by the manufacturer decades ago. Even if you could find them, and at this point, he said, that was genuinely unlikely the labor required to rebuild the engine to the original specification would be, in his professional opinion, prohibitive. He used that word carefully. Prohibitive. Not impossible, but close enough that the distinction felt academic. Amelia asked him what it would cost. He named a figure. She told him she would pay it. He shook his head, not unkindly, and said that the problem was not the money. The problem was that even with the money, the parts did not exist. He had already checked. His suppliers had no inventory. The secondary market had nothing that met the specification. He was sorry. He really was. But in his professional judgment, the car was beyond repair. And the responsible thing to tell her was that she should consider having it preserved as a static display rather than attempting a restoration that was, in all likelihood, going to end in disappointment. By this point, a small cluster of people had drifted toward the conversation. It was the kind of thing that happens in a large public space when something unusual is occurring. Not a crowd, exactly, but an audience, assembled without intention. A man in an expensive jacket made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough that Amelia heard it. A woman near the door was whispering something to her companion. One of the technicians, a young man with his arms crossed, was watching Amelia with the particular expression of someone who has already decided how the story ends. Amelia owned a company worth several $1 billion. Her name appeared on a list of the most powerful women in American business. But standing in that garage, looking at the car her father had driven, listening to a man explain calmly why the most important object in her personal life could not be saved, she felt something that she did not usually allow herself to feel in front of other people. She felt helpless. And she felt it in front of witnesses, which made it worse. The voice came from the far end of the garage. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It said, simply and without particular ceremony, "I think I might be able to help." The laughter that followed was immediate and genuine. Marcus Webb turned toward the sound, with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a serious conversation by something he considers irrelevant. The technicians exchanged glances. A couple of them smiled. The man standing at the back of the garage was not an impressive figure at first glance. He was perhaps 34 years old, lean in the way that comes from actually using your body rather than maintaining it, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried a few days of unshaved stubble. His work shirt was navy blue, and it had seen considerably better days. There was a tear near the left shoulder, and the front was marked with the particular geography of a man who spent his days inside engine compartments. Grease along the forearms, a smear of something dark near the collar. The general condition of clothes that belonged to the job rather than the person wearing them. His name was Daniel Carter. He was not an employee of Sterling Automotive. He was what the industry called a contract specialist, a freelance mechanic who worked out of a rented bay at the back of the garage on a month-to-month arrangement that Marcus Webb had entered into, largely because Daniel's hourly rate was low enough to make his presence financially sensible. He had no certifications on the wall. He had no official website. He did not advertise. What he had was a reputation, in a narrow and specific circle, for being exceptionally good at the kind of work that other mechanics found too complicated or too time-consuming to be profitable. Marcus Webb had never said this out loud, but he was aware of it. And he was also aware that acknowledging it would require acknowledging that Daniel Carter, in his rented bay at the back of the garage, was doing something that his senior staff could not do. That was not an acknowledgement Marcus Webb was inclined to make. Daniel walked forward slowly, his hands in his pockets, and looked at the Galaxie with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who is reading a page rather than glancing at a cover. He circled the car once, said nothing, then crouched near the front end and looked at something that Amelia could not quite identify from where she was standing. One of the technicians made a comment under his breath. Another one laughed. Marcus Webb told Daniel, in a tone that was polite in structure but dismissive in content, that the matter had already been assessed by qualified professionals, and that the verdict was final. Daniel straightened up, looked at Amelia, and said, "Would you mind if I took a closer look? Just the engine bay." Amelia looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who has decided that the fastest way to end a situation is to let it play out. He made a gesture that was technically a permission and functionally a dismissal. Daniel opened the hood. He stood over the engine for a long time, not touching anything yet. Just looking. Amelia watched him and felt something shift, slightly, in the way she was standing, a loosening of the tension she had been carrying since the car stopped moving. There was something in the quality of his attention that was different from what she had observed in the technicians who had worked on the car earlier. They had moved with efficiency. He moved with consideration. He touched a component near the back of the engine block, traced something with one finger, and then stood up and looked at her with an expression that was not quite confidence but was something adjacent to it, a kind of careful, honest assessment, the look of someone who does not make promises but who is not yet ready to agree that a situation is hopeless. "I won't promise it's easy," he said, "but I don't think it's past saving." The laughter in the garage had quieted slightly, but it had not entirely gone away. The news traveled faster than Daniel expected, and in directions he had not anticipated. By the following morning, 3 separate forums, dedicated to classic American automobiles, had posts discussing the situation, the Galaxie, the verdict from Sterling Automotive, and the unnamed freelance mechanic who had apparently told a CEO that the car her team of professionals had declared terminal was, in his estimation, repairable. The tone of most posts was skeptical. The more experienced collectors tended toward the resigned conclusion that someone was either misrepresenting his qualifications or trying to extract money from a desperate and wealthy client. The language was not always kind. Marcus Webb, for his part, was not difficult to reach. He told the 2 journalists who contacted him that his assessment stood, that the engine components in question had not been in production since the early 1970s, and that while he respected the enthusiasm of independent operators, enthusiasm was not the same thing as engineering capacity. A colleague of Amelia's, a woman named Sandra Park, who handled public relations for Meridian Technologies, called Amelia on a Wednesday morning and said, in the diplomatic tone she used when delivering information she expected to be unwelcome, that people were talking about the situation and that it might be worth reconsidering the arrangement before it became a distraction. 2 of Amelia's closest friends told her, separately and in different words, that she was grieving, that she was attaching irrational importance to a machine, and that the healthy thing to do was to find a skilled metalworker who could preserve the car's appearance, even if the engine could not be made to run, and to let that be enough. Amelia heard all of this. She considered it seriously, the way she considered most things, not dismissively, not defensively, but with the methodical attention she brought to decisions that mattered. And then she thought about Daniel Carter crouching near the front of the car, and the way he had looked at the engine, and the way he had said what he said, not as a sales pitch, not as a boast, not as a performance for the room, but as a plain statement of what he believed after looking at the evidence. She had spent 12 years of her professional life making decisions based on her ability to read people, to distinguish between confidence that was genuine and confidence that was borrowed, to tell the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who wanted you to believe they did. She called Daniel that Thursday evening and told him she wanted to proceed. There was a brief silence on his end of the line. Then he said, "All right, give me a few days to look at everything properly. I'll be honest with you about what I find." She told him she expected nothing less. What she did not tell him, because she was not yet sure how to say it, was that the certainty in his voice, quiet, undramatic, offered without any apparent need for her approval, was the thing that had convinced her. It reminded her of her father, not in a way she could have easily explained to Sandra Park or her well-meaning friends, just in a private, interior way that she had learned, over the years, to trust. 3 days later, Daniel called her. His voice was careful in the way that voices get when the news is complicated, and the person delivering it is trying to be fair to all its complexity. He had pulled the engine, not the whole thing at once. He had started with the accessible components, the ones that the sterling automotive technicians had already assessed, and then he had gone further, past the point where the initial diagnostics had stopped, into the internal architecture of the engine block itself. What he found there was not what he had expected, and it was not, he said, what anyone should have found. Someone had repaired this engine before. A long time ago, he estimated the work was done sometime in the mid to late 1990s, based on the materials used and the way the repair had aged. The repair had been done incorrectly, or at least insufficiently, in a way that someone with the right knowledge could have identified at the time, but that the average mechanic, working quickly and without the specific expertise required for engines of this era, might easily have missed. A critical timing component had been replaced with a part that was close to the original specification but not identical to it, an aftermarket piece that was cheaper and more available, and that functioned adequately under normal conditions, but that was not designed to sustain the thermal stress and patterns generated by this particular engine over years of intermittent use. The mismatch had done its damage slowly. A hairline fracture here, a gradual misalignment there, by the time the car stopped on the road last Tuesday. The accumulated damage of decades had arrived at a threshold, but in this was the part that Daniel wanted her to understand clearly. The underlying engine block was structurally intact. The original engineering was sound. The problem was not with what the car had been built to be. The problem was with what someone had done to it, imperfectly, a long time ago. He had found the original service records in a waterproofed envelope tucked under the floor mat of the trunk, behind the spare tire. They were faded but readable. They documented the car's maintenance history going back to its original purchase. And there, in a handwritten entry from 1992, was the name of the garage that had done the repair. The garage no longer existed, but the address was in a part of the city that Amelia recognized immediately. It was 3 blocks from the house where she had grown up. She sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. Her father had taken the car to a local garage when something went wrong, and whoever had worked on it had done their best with the tools and knowledge available to them, and the car had continued to run for another 30 years before the imperfection finally accumulated into crisis. It was, she thought, a very human story. And it was, she thought, a very human kind of damage. Not malicious, not careless in any dramatic sense. Just limited the ordinary limitation of someone working at the edge of their knowledge, doing the best they could with what they had. She found herself, unexpectedly, and without quite understanding why, thinking about her father differently, not as the man who had left her the car, as the man who had driven the car for years, knowing it had been repaired, trusting the repair, never knowing that under the hood something was slowly, quietly accumulating toward failure. There were things about her father's life she had not known. There would always be things she had not known. The car was becoming, strangely, an archive. The part that Daniel needed did not exist. He had spent 4 days confirming this with a thoroughness that Amelia found both impressive and faintly alarming. He had contacted every major supplier of vintage Ford parts in the country. He had reached out to private collectors. He had posted on forums, sent emails to restoration specialists in 5 states, made phone calls to people who had been restoring cars from this era for 30 years. The responses ranged from sympathetic to blunt. The original component had not been manufactured since 1973. The secondary market had dried up in the early 2000s as the remaining stock was absorbed into other restoration projects, and the one collector who had contacted Daniel to say he believed he might have one turned out, after further investigation, to have a component from a different engine generation that would not fit the Galaxie's block without significant and inadvisable modification. There was no part. The part was gone. And without it, nothing else Daniel had done would matter. He told Amelia this on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in the rented bay at the back of Sterling Automotive, with the disassembled engine spread around him on a workbench, and the floor like a puzzle that had been taken apart, and was waiting, patiently, for someone to understand it well enough to put it back together. She listened. She asked a few questions. Then she asked the question that had been forming in the back of her mind since the moment he had told her about the missing part. Could it be made? Not found. Made, fabricated from scratch, to the original specification, by someone who knew what they were doing. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that it was theoretically possible. He had the original technical drawings, sourced from a Ford Motor Company archive, that a restorer he knew had digitized years ago and shared with the community. He had access to a machine shop. He had done fabrication work before, though nothing quite at this level of precision. The challenge was not knowledge. The challenge was tolerances, the microscopic measurements that determined whether a component performed as designed or failed, and the gap between what the drawing specified and what his available equipment could reliably produce. He told her the probability was not good. He told her that every hour he spent attempting it was an hour he was not earning the hourly rate that paid his daughter's after-school program and his rent. He told her all of this in a level, undramatic way, and then he said that he was going to try anyway, because he did not think the alternative was acceptable. Amelia offered him money. He accepted enough to cover his operating costs and nothing more. She told him she appreciated that. He shrugged and said he didn't see the point of taking more than he needed. It was said without particular virtue, as a simple statement of how he operated, and Amelia found it, in the context of an industry and a city where she spent most of her time, surrounded by people who took as much as they could get, quietly extraordinary. She did not say that out loud. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. The first prototype failed in the 3rd week. Daniel had spent 11 days fabricating it, working in the early mornings before his daughter needed to be at school, and in the evenings after she was in bed, and occasionally in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning when the machine shop was empty and he could use the equipment without interruption. He had been meticulous. He had measured to fractions that required a precision instrument he had borrowed from a machinist friend who specialized in aerospace components. He had done the calculations by hand and then checked them electronically and then done them by hand again. He had been careful in a way that he was not always able to be careful in his regular work, where the economics of labor made extreme precision a luxury rather than a standard. When he installed the component and ran the first startup sequence, the engine fired briefly and then ceased. The failure was not catastrophic. Nothing broke in a way that could not be reversed. But it was definitive. The tolerances were off. Not by much, not by anything that the naked eye could have seen, but off enough that under load, the thermal expansion of the metal under heat had created friction where there should have been clearance. and the engine had locked. He sat on the floor of the bay for a long time after that. He had told Amelia he would be honest with her about what he found. And he was honest now. He called her and told her what had happened without softening the news. She was quiet for a moment. And then she asked him what had gone wrong. He explained. She asked what he needed to do differently. He told her. She said, "All right, keep going." Marcus Webb walked through the back of the garage the next morning and paused when he saw Daniel at the workbench with the failed component in his hands, already examining the failure surfaces under a magnifying glass. Webb said nothing at first. Then he said, in the tone of a man performing an act of fairness that he found personally inconvenient, "For what it's worth, a lot of experienced people have tried this kind of fabrication work and walked away." Daniel looked up. "I know," he said. "How many of them had the original drawings?" Webb considered that for a moment, then walked away without answering. It was not a concession, but it was not entirely dismissive either. The second prototype took 2 more weeks. Daniel had revised his measurements after studying the failure surfaces of the first attempt. He had adjusted the machining parameters on 3 separate dimensions. He had also, in a development that he had not mentioned to anyone because he was not yet sure whether to be proud of it or embarrassed by it, written a series of thermal simulation calculations on a legal pad by hand, working through the equations that predicted how the metal would behave under the temperature cycles of a running engine, trying to find the precise tolerances that would allow for expansion without creating friction. He was not a formally trained engineer. He had never taken a university course in thermodynamics. What he had was 20 years of practical knowledge, a collection of technical manuals that he had been reading since he was a teenager, and the kind of specific, accumulated intuition that develops in people who have spent a very long time paying close attention to how things work. He was also running low on money. The materials for the second prototype had cost more than he had told Amelia, because he had found a better alloy source that matched the original specification more closely, and he had paid the difference himself without mentioning it. His daughter, who was 7 years old and named Sophie, had asked him that Sunday morning why he looked tired. He told her he was working on something difficult. She asked if he was going to finish it. He told her yes. She accepted this with the uncritical confidence of a child who has never had a reason to doubt her father's word, and went back to her cereal, and Daniel sat with his coffee and thought about the thermal simulation on the legal pad and where he thought he had found his error. 3 days after Daniel installed the second prototype and ran the preliminary test sequence, the engine still would not sustain. It fired. It held for 31 seconds. Then it stopped. Not a seizure this time, a different kind of failure, a timing issue. Subtle enough that he almost missed it in the data he had recorded. He sat in the bay that evening and did not work. He just sat. Sophie was with her grandmother that week, which meant the apartment was quiet when he got home, and the quiet had a particular quality that he found difficult on the evenings when things had not gone well. He had been in this specific kind of discouragement before. He knew its shape and its duration, and he knew that the appropriate response was neither to force it to pass nor to surrender to it, but simply to sit with it until it ran its course. He made himself dinner. He watched an old program on television without really watching it. He fell asleep on the couch and woke at 2 in the morning with the apartment dark and still, and a thought in his head that had arrived while he was sleeping, the way thoughts sometimes do. The timing system, not the component he had fabricated. The timing system itself, the chain, the guides, the tensioner assembly. What if the original repair, the one done in 1992, had affected not just the component that had failed, but the calibration of the entire timing system? What if everything had been off, slightly, for 30 years? And the car had been running with a compensated timing that masked the original error. And the fabricated component, perfectly made to the original specification, was now operating in a system that had been adjusted around an imperfection that no longer existed. He called Amelia at 6:30 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. He explained what he was thinking. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Have you slept?" He told her he had slept some. She told him she thought he was right, and that he should check it immediately. He said he intended to. She asked if he needed anything. He told her he needed about 4 hours. She said she would be there in 3. What Daniel found when he examined the timing system that morning was both simpler and more profound than he had imagined at 2 in the morning on his couch. The 1992 repair had indeed left the timing slightly off, not drastically, not enough to make the car run badly in any obvious way, but enough that over 3 decades of use the engine had been operating with a compensated calibration that every subsequent mechanic who had worked on it had accepted as the baseline. The service records documented it. In a way, if you knew what you were looking at. There were adjustments, minor and recurring, that appeared in the notes every few years, adjustments that a careful reader might have recognized as the signature of a system compensating for a foundational error. Every mechanic who had worked on the car since 1992 had been solving the wrong problem. They had been treating symptoms of a misalignment that nobody had identified, because nobody had looked far enough back in the chain of causes. The Sterling automotive technicians had not looked far enough back. They had assessed what was visibly damaged and concluded, correctly as far as their assessment went, that the damaged components were irreplaceable. They had not asked why the damage had accumulated in the pattern it had. They had not followed the evidence back to its origin. Daniel had. He spent that morning recalibrating the timing system to the factory specification, the specification that had been in effect before the 1992 repair, the one documented in the original technical manual that he had sourced from the digitized archive. It was painstaking work. It required him to undo adjustments that had been made incrementally over 30 years by mechanics, who had each been doing what they understood to be the right thing. He reinstalled the fabricated component, the second prototype, the one that had failed at 31 seconds, with the system now calibrated to the original specification. He checked every connection. He verified every measurement. Amelia was standing near the front of the bay, and she had not spoken for the past hour, which he had noticed and appreciated. Marcus Webb had appeared in the doorway twice without saying anything. 3 of the technicians were visible at the edge of the bay, watching. The garage had gone unusually quiet. Daniel stood up. He closed the hood. He looked at Amelia and said, "This is it." She nodded. She was holding her keys, and she did not look like the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar technology company. She looked like a person standing on the edge of something that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with money or reputation or professional standing. She looked like someone who wanted very much to go back to a Saturday afternoon when she was 9 years old, and there was nothing in the world except her father's hands on the wheel and the road ahead, and the sound of this particular engine doing exactly what it was built to do. Daniel took the keys. He got in. He sat for a moment with his hand on the ignition and his eyes on the dashboard. And then he turned the key. The engine caught. It ran. The sound it made was not the struggling, uneven noise of a machine trying to sustain itself despite its damage. It was the full, unhurried sound of an engine running, as it was designed to run. At the RPM it was designed to sustain, without hesitation and without apology. For a long moment nobody in the garage moved. Marcus Webb, standing in the doorway, had an expression on his face that was not quite any of the expressions that people usually wear. It was the expression of a person who has held a position for a long time and has just encountered evidence that the position may require revision, and who has not yet decided how to process that information. The technicians who had laughed in the first week were quiet, in a way that was notably different from ordinary quiet. Daniel turned the engine off. He got out of the car. He looked at the engine for a moment longer, then reached for the cloth on the workbench, and began to wipe his hands with the methodical, unhurried motion of someone for whom the gesture was entirely routine. Amelia walked to the front of the car. She put both hands on the hood, not quite an embrace, but something close to it, and she stood there for a moment. And then the tears came. She did not try to stop them. She did not look around to see who was watching. She let them come, and they came quietly, and they were for her father and for the car, and for the 30 years of an imperfect repair that had accumulated into crisis, and for the strange, improbable grace of a man who had known how to look far enough back to find the real problem. Daniel said nothing. He continued to wipe his hands. He understood, without needing it explained, that this moment was not about him. Amelia did not plan what she did next. It was not a calculated decision, not a strategic communication choice, not the kind of thing that went through Sandra Park's office before execution. She simply told the truth, in public, because the truth seemed like the only appropriate response to what had happened. She called a journalist she trusted, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who covered business and technology for a national publication and who had written about Amelia before, with the kind of fairness that made Amelia willing to answer her calls. She told Patricia that she had a story for her, and the story was not about Meridian Technologies. Patricia listened. She asked questions. She took notes. She spent 2 days independently verifying the timeline. The diagnosis from Sterling Automotive, the names of the people who had laughed, the forums where the restoration community had discussed Daniel Carter's chances in language that ranged from doubtful to contemptuous, and, at the end, the engine running. The article ran on a Thursday morning. It was not a long article. Patricia was not a writer who believed that length was a virtue in itself, but it was a precise article, and it was accurate, and it described, without sentimentality, but also without minimization, exactly what had happened. A machine that multiple certified professionals had declared irreparable, repaired by a man who most of those professionals had publicly dismissed because he had been willing to ask a question that none of them had asked. By Friday afternoon, the article had been picked up by 4 other publications, and a significant number of people who cared about vintage automobiles, independent craftspeople, or the specific satisfaction of watching an expert consensus turn out to be wrong. Daniel's phone began receiving messages from people whose cars had problems. A collector in Colorado, who had been told by 2 shops that his 1958 Chevrolet was unrestorable. A widow in Georgia, whose late husband's 1967 Mustang had been sitting in a garage for 8 years because nobody could identify what was wrong with it. A retired mechanic in Michigan who said he had the same problem Daniel had described and had always wondered if anyone would ever figure out the real cause. Marcus Webb, for his part, issued a statement through Sterling Automotive's communications channel that read, in its entirety, "We stand behind our original assessment, which was based on the information available at the time and reflected the professional judgment of experienced technicians. We acknowledge that Mr. Carter's subsequent work produced an unexpected result, and we respect that outcome." It was not an apology. It was as close to an apology as Marcus Webb was capable of arriving at in writing, and Amelia suspected he had spent considerable time on it. She read it once and did not read it again. Amelia met with Daniel the following Monday. She had brought a proposal, a formal one, documented and detailed, because she was a person who did not leave important things to implication. The proposal was for a restoration center, a purpose-built facility, properly equipped, staffed with technicians who would be trained by Daniel, dedicated to vintage vehicle restoration with a focus on the kind of deeply complex cases that standard garages either refused or failed to solve. She had done the financial modeling herself over the weekend, and the numbers were good. The market for high-quality vintage restoration was larger than most people realized, underserved at the level of genuine technical excellence, and positioned to grow as the generation that had grown up with these cars reached an age at which they had both the means and the motivation to invest in preserving them. She laid this out for him with the clarity and organization of someone who had spent a career turning ideas into operating realities. He listened to all of it. Then he said, with the same directness he had used throughout, "I appreciate what you're proposing. I really do. And I understand why it makes sense from your perspective. But I don't want to run a center." She had anticipated this possibility. She asked him what he meant by it. He said he meant that managing a business, the administrative work, the staffing decisions, the financial reporting, the things that turned a skill into an institution was not what he was good at and not what he wanted to do with the years he had. What he wanted to do was work on cars. Specifically, the kind of work he had done on the Galaxie, the cases that other people had given up on, the engines that told stories if you knew how to listen to them. He was not modest about his ability to do that work. He knew what he was capable of. He also knew exactly where his capabilities ended. And running an organization was past that line. Amelia studied him for a moment. Then she said, "What if I ran it? And you were the reason it existed?" He thought about that for a while. What they arrived at, over the next 2 hours, was an arrangement that suited them both. Daniel would work as the lead restoration specialist, taking the cases he chose, training the technicians he believed were capable of learning from him, and setting the technical standards that the center would maintain. Amelia would handle everything else. She would provide the capital, the infrastructure, the organizational architecture. She would make the business decisions. He would make the mechanical ones. Neither of them would have authority over the other's domain. It was, she thought afterward, the most honest business arrangement she had made in 12 years of making them. The center opened 6 months later. It was not a grand opening. Daniel had stipulated that. And Amelia had agreed. There was no ribbon cutting, no press event, no catered reception. The doors opened on a Tuesday morning, which was the same day of the week that the Galaxie had stopped on the road, and the first car brought in was a 1961 Lincoln Continental that a man from Phoenix had been trying to get running for 11 years. Daniel looked at it for a long time before he said anything. Then he said he thought he knew what the problem was, and he was going to need a few days to confirm it, and the man from Phoenix should leave him the service records if he had them, because the service records always tell you something. The man from Phoenix, who had been told by 6 garages that his car was beyond saving, said he would leave whatever Daniel needed. The restored Galaxie was kept at the center. Not as a display, not as a marketing piece, not as a trophy. It was simply there, parked in a corner of the main workshop, driven occasionally when Amelia came by, maintained with the same careful attention that Daniel brought to every car he worked on. He had found, in one of the final stages of the restoration, a small detail that he had not mentioned in his report. Carved into the underside of the dashboard, in the careful letters of someone who had used a small tool and taken their time, was a set of initials and a date. The initials were R.G. The date was 1964, the year the car was made. The year Amelia's father would have been 19 years old. The year, she realized when she thought about it, that Robert Grant had bought this car new, as a young man, with his life still largely ahead of him. She had not known that. She had known the car her whole life, and she had not known that her father had owned it since he was 19. She had thought of it as a thing he had left her, a possession that had passed from his hands to hers. She understood now that it was something else, a continuous object, a thing that had traveled through time alongside her father, that had been with him before she existed, that had carried him through the years of his life and then, when he was gone, had remained. The damage done to it had been human and unintentional, and had accumulated over decades into something that looked, from a distance, like a final and irreversible ending. The repair had required someone willing to look past what was visibly broken and ask what had caused the damage in the first place. That, Amelia thought, was not a lesson about cars. On the last evening before the center's formal operations began, Amelia drove the Galaxie on the route she had been driving the Tuesday. Everything fell apart. She drove it past the point where the engine had stopped. She drove it to the building where her father's name was now on the wall, and she sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running, listening to it the way he had told her to listen when she was 9 years old. The engine spoke in the language he had taught her. Steady and even. The sound of something working as it was meant to work, without excess and without apology. She did not feel the particular grief of loss that had accompanied every other time she had thought about him since his death. She felt something else, something quieter and less expected, something closer to the feeling of a long conversation resumed after an interruption. Not resolution, exactly. Not the closure that people talked about as if grief were a door you could close and leave behind. Something more like continuation. The recognition that the things we love do not end simply because we stop being able to see them, and that sometimes it takes someone willing to look past the obvious damage to find what was never actually gone. Amelia Grant owned a company worth several $billions. She had offices on 4 continents, and a name that appeared on every relevant list. None of that was what she felt, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running. What she felt was smaller and truer than any of it. A young woman in her father's car, on a road he had driven, listening to an engine that someone had believed in enough to save. The most important things, she had learned, were rarely the ones that looked impressive from the outside. They were the ones that kept running long after everyone else had said they were finished. They were the ones that a man in a worn work shirt, covered in grease, with a child at home in a rented bay at the back of someone else's garage, had looked at without flinching and said, "I don't think it's past saving." He had been right. He had been right in the way that people are right, when they are not performing certainty, but simply reporting what they see when the gap between what the world tells you is possible and what you can see with your own eyes is wide, enough that you have no choice but to trust your eyes. Daniel Carter had trusted his eyes. And because he had, a car that had been declared dead was running. Because he had, a woman who had been quietly, privately grieving, had found something she had not known was still there to be found. Because he had, and because he had not needed the world's permission to believe it, a story that had looked, from the outside, like a story about failure, had turned out to be something else entirely. It had turned out to be a story about the things that hold, the things that outlast doubt, the things that are worth believing in when all the evidence says otherwise. The engine ran. It ran clean and steady, and without complaint, the way it had been built to run 60 years ago, on a road somewhere, driven by a 19-year-old who did not yet know what his life was going to become, who had no way of knowing that this particular machine, this specific collection of metal and engineering and human intention, would outlast him and carry pieces of him forward, and one day be the thing that helped his daughter find her way back to him. The road was the same road it had always been. The car was the same car, and somewhere in the machine, in the metal and the motion and the sound, something that had seemed lost was simply waiting to be heard again by someone who knew how to listen.